When most Halo fans hear the name the Didact, they picture a villain, a towering forerunner emerging from an ancient cryptum after 100,000 years of imprisonment, a being of immense power who viewed humanity as little more than a failed experiment, the mastermind behind the composer's horrific use against Earth, the final enemy Master Chief faced before the rise of Cortana and the Created. That is how history remembers him. But history often remembers only the ending. Long before he became the Didact humanity encountered in Halo 4, he was something entirely different. He was the greatest military commander the Forerunner Akumene had ever produced. For millions of years, he defended civilizations that would never know his name. He stood between the galaxy and threats capable of destroying entire worlds. His victory shaped an age of peace so long that most Forerunners eventually forgot what true war even looked like. To those who served beside him, he represented everything a warrior servant was meant to become: disciplined, honorable, brilliant, and utterly devoted to protecting life. He did not seek power for its own sake. He accepted responsibility because someone had to bear it. The irony is almost unbearable. History celebrates the librarian as the woman who saved the galaxy. It remembers the Didact as the man who nearly destroyed it. Yet for most of their lives, these two were inseparable: husband and wife, protector and life worker, two of the most respected figures in the entire Akumene. They shared the same dream, believed in the same ideals, and devoted millions of years to the same purpose: saving life. So how did everything fall apart? How does a hero become a tyrant? How does the galaxy's greatest defender come to hate the very people he once swore to protect? The answer is not found in a single battle or a single decision. It was forged over millions of years. It began with impossible wars. It deepened through political betrayal. It was poisoned by the flood. It was twisted by grief. And it was finally broken by an impossible choice between preserving civilization and preserving life itself. Unlike many villains, the Didact never believed he had become evil. At every stage of his life, he believed he was saving the galaxy. When he led fleets into battle, he fought to preserve peace. When he opposed humanity, he believed he was protecting the Akumene. When he embraced the composer, he believed he had found the only weapon capable of defeating the flood. Even 100,000 years later, after emerging from his cryptum to wage war against humanity once again, he still viewed himself not as a conqueror, but as the last guardian willing to do what others lacked the courage to accomplish. That belief is what makes his story so compelling. The Didact was never corrupted by greed. He was never seduced by power. He did not betray the galaxy for personal gain. He sacrificed pieces of himself, one after another, until almost nothing remained except duty. Duty without hope or compassion, and duty without the woman who had spent millions of years reminding him what he was truly fighting to protect. Perhaps that is the greatest tragedy in all of Halo. The flood did not simply consume worlds. It consumed people. Not always through infection, sometimes through despair. By the time Master Chief stood before the Didact on Requiem, the battle had already been lost long ago. The warrior servant, who had once defended the galaxy, had disappeared beneath 100,000 years of grief, isolation, and hatred. To understand the Didact is not to excuse what he became. It is to understand what he once was, because before he became Halo's villain, he was its greatest hero. Long before he became the Didact, before the flood, before humanity, and before the halo array. He was simply another forerunner born into a civilization that had ruled the galaxy for millions of years. His birth name was Shadow of Sundered Star. Today, most fans refer to him as the Didact to distinguish him from the Didact, the younger forerunner who would later inherit his title during the final years of the Flood War. Throughout most of his life, however, there was only one Didact, simply the Didact. To understand why that title carried such weight, it is important to understand the society that created him. The Forerunners organized their civilization into specialized rates, each dedicated to a different responsibility. Builders designed the vast megastructures that stretched across the galaxy. Life workers studied and preserved life itself. Miners harvested worlds. Juridicials upheld the law. Every citizen contributed to the ecumene according to the role for which they were best suited. The warrior servants stood apart. They were not merely soldiers. They were the guardians of civilization. The ecumene had enjoyed such overwhelming dominance for so long that true warfare had become increasingly rare. Most warrior servants spent their lives suppressing piracy, responding to isolated conflicts, or protecting developing species under the mantle of responsibility. Their role demanded not only exceptional military skill, but discipline, restraint, and wisdom. They carried the authority to wage war, but they were expected to do so only when every other option had failed. Among these elite protectors, one individual distinguished himself above all others. Shadow of Sundered Star possessed an extraordinary strategic mind. He understood warfare on a scale few others could comprehend, coordinating fleets that spanned entire star systems, while simultaneously considering the political, logistical, and humanitarian consequences of every campaign. To him, victory meant more than defeating an enemy. It meant preserving as much life as possible. This philosophy earned him immense respect throughout the ecumene. Warriors admired his courage. Political leaders trusted his judgment. Even those who disagreed with his decisions rarely questioned his integrity. Over time, his influence grew so great that he became the supreme military leader of the warrior servants. With that position came a title, Didact. The word itself carries multiple meanings depending on context, but at its heart, it describes one who teaches through example. The title reflected far more than military rank. The Didact was expected to embody everything the warrior servants represented. Every decision he made would become an example for future generations. Every victory would shape military doctrine across the ecumene. He accepted that burden willingly. Unlike many powerful figures throughout history, the Didact never appeared interested in personal glory. He viewed command as a responsibility rather than a privilege. Those who served beneath him frequently remarked that he demanded more from himself than from anyone else. If he ordered others into danger, he expected to share that danger. If sacrifices became necessary, he believed leaders should bear the greatest burden. These qualities made him exceptionally popular among the warrior servants. They trusted him because they believed he would never waste their lives. Perhaps even more importantly, the Didact possessed something increasingly rare within the ancient ecumene: humility. Despite commanding one of the greatest military forces in the galaxy, he never assumed victory was inevitable. He studied potential enemies carefully, respected capable opponents, and constantly questioned his own strategies. In his view, arrogance was among the greatest dangers any commander could face. Ironically, that lesson would later define his greatest failure. At the height of his career, the Didact represented the very best of Forerunner civilization. He believed deeply and the mantle of responsibility. He genuinely wished to protect weaker species. He saw military force as a last resort rather than the first solution. Even those who opposed his policies generally accepted that his motives were honorable. It is impossible to overstate how respected he was. Before the flood, if one had asked a forerunner to name the individual most capable of defending the galaxy, almost everyone would have given the same answer: the Didact. His achievements on the battlefield earned him legendary status, but they were only part of the reason he became such an influential figure. His greatest strength lay in something far less tangible. People believed in him. That trust extended well beyond the warrior servants. Builders sought his counsel during times of crisis. Life workers respected his willingness to protect rather than dominate. Political leaders frequently deferred to his judgment on matters affecting the security of the Ecumene. Among those who admired him most was a brilliant life worker whose understanding of life rivaled his understanding of war. She challenged his assumptions, questioned his conclusions, reminded him that every military victory ultimately existed to protect living worlds rather than simply defeat enemies. The two could not have approached the universe more differently, yet together they became one of the greatest partnerships the galaxy would ever know. Her title was the Librarian. History often remembers great leaders for the battles they fought. Far less often does it remember the people who shaped them. Long before the flood consumed the galaxy, before political divisions fractured the Ecumene, and before impossible choices forced them onto opposite sides of history, the Didact met the woman who would become the single greatest influence on his life, the Librarian. Like the Didact, she was already earning a remarkable reputation within her own rate. Where the warrior servants existed to defend civilization, the life workers devoted themselves to understanding and preserving life itself. The Librarian quickly distinguished herself as one of the finest minds of her generation, traveling throughout the Ecumene to study ecosystems, catalog species, and uncover the countless ways life adapted across the galaxy. At first glance, the two seemed to have almost nothing in common. The Didact understood fleets. The Librarian understood forests. He spent his life preparing for war. She spent hers trying to ensure that war never became necessary. He measured success by the lives protected, and she measured success by the lives allowed to flourish. Those differences became the very reason they worked so well together. The Didact had spent centuries studying conflict. He understood how civilizations collapsed, how military campaigns unfolded, and how difficult decisions had to be made when every available option carried terrible consequences. His perspective was necessarily pragmatic. Leaders could not always choose between good and evil. More often, they were forced to choose between two tragedies. The Librarian reminded him why those choices mattered. Whenever the Didact spoke of defending worlds, she spoke of the people living upon them. Whenever he discussed preserving civilization, she spoke of preserving the countless forms of life that gave civilization meaning. Neither dismissed the other's perspective. Instead, each completed what the other lacked. It was a partnership built upon profound mutual respect. The Librarian admired the Didact because, unlike many military commanders, he never glorified war. He viewed violence as a burden rather than an achievement. Even after brilliant victories, his attention often turned immediately toward rebuilding, relief efforts, and preventing future conflicts. She saw a protector, not a conqueror. The Didact admired the Librarian for an entirely different reason. She possessed an intellectual honesty that was extraordinarily rare, even among the greatest minds of the Ecumene. If new evidence challenged one of her conclusions, she did not defend her pride. She changed her mind. To the Didact, whose responsibilities required constant adaptation, this willingness to question assumptions represented genuine strength. Over time, admiration became companionship. Companionship became love. Their marriage united two of the most influential figures in the entire ecumene. Many later accounts describe them as opposites, but that is only partially true. In reality, they shared the same ultimate goal. Both wished to preserve life. They simply approached that responsibility from different directions. The Didact believed peace was secured through strength. The librarian believed peace endured through understanding. For millions of years, those philosophies existed in harmony. The librarian frequently accompanied the Didact as an advisor, offering perspectives that military planners often overlooked. Likewise, the Didact's experience protecting the ecumene informed many of the librarian's own decisions regarding conservation and exploration. Each trusted the other's judgment implicitly. There were disagreements, of course. No marriage lasting millions of years could exist without them. The Didact occasionally believed the librarian underestimated the dangers facing the galaxy. The librarian sometimes worried that her husband placed too much faith in military solutions. Yet these debates rarely created resentment. Instead, they sharpened one another's thinking. The Didact became more compassionate because of her. The librarian became more pragmatic because of him. Looking back, it is easy to forget that for most of their lives, they were not tragic figures. They were remarkably happy. Together they represented the very best qualities of the Forerunner civilization. One embodied its strength, the other embodied its wisdom. Few couples in Halo's history have ever possessed greater influence, and perhaps none have ever trusted one another more completely. That trust would eventually be tested in ways neither could have imagined. Because while the Didact and the librarian were building a future they hoped would endure forever, another civilization was quietly growing beyond the borders of the ecumene. It was ambitious. It was expanding rapidly, and it had already begun fighting an enemy the Forerunners did not yet understand. It was humanity. For most of his life, the Didact believed that civilization was protected through vigilance. Peace was not something that simply existed. It had to be defended. Every generation inherited the responsibility of preserving the order created by those who came before. The ecumene had endured for millions of years because its guardians remained prepared for threats, even during centuries when no obvious enemy existed. Then humanity emerged. When the Didact first became involved with the growing tensions between the Forerunners and ancient humanity, he did not see a civilization destined to inherit the mantle. He saw an expanding power whose ambitions increasingly brought it into conflict with the ecumene. Ancient humanity was nothing like the primitive species modern audiences recognize. They possessed vast fleets, advanced technology, powerful military forces. Their empire stretched across enormous regions of the Orion Arm and stood as one of the few civilizations capable of challenging Forerunner authority. To many within the ecumene, humanity had become unpredictable. To the Didact, unpredictability was dangerous. As reports of human incursions reached the warrior servants, he approached the situation as he always had: gather the facts, protect the ecumene, prevent greater bloodshed. Yet almost immediately, the conflict proved unlike any he had ever previously encountered. Human forces attacked worlds under Forerunner protection. Colonies were abandoned without explanation. Entire systems appeared to be sacrificed by humanity's own fleets. To the Didact, these actions made little sense. Conquest usually followed clear strategic objectives: territory, resources, political influence. Humanity often seemed willing to destroy all three. The Didact interpreted these actions as evidence that humanity had become increasingly reckless, perhaps even desperate. The Ecumene's leadership reached a similar conclusion. War became inevitable. For the Didact, this was not a conflict born from hatred. It was duty. As supreme commander of the warrior servants, he believed his responsibility was clear: defend Forerunner space, protect client species, end the conflict as quickly as possible. The war that followed would become one of the largest military campaigns in galactic history. For decades, fleets numbering in the thousands fought across countless systems. Entire worlds became battlefields. Ancient human fortresses fell one after another beneath the overwhelming technological superiority of the Ecumene. Despite those advantages, however, humanity fought with astonishing determination. The Didact could not help but respect them. Their commanders demonstrated remarkable ingenuity. Their soldiers refused to surrender even when defeat became inevitable. Again and again, they adapted to situations that would have broken lesser civilizations. The Didact had fought many enemies throughout his long career. Few impressed him as much as humanity. That respect, however, did not soften his resolve. If anything, it strengthened it. A capable enemy demanded decisive action before the conflict could grow even more destructive. Eventually, the Forerunners prevailed. Human fleets were shattered. Their empire collapsed. Their leaders, including the legendary Lord of Admirals Forthencho, were captured. The Ecumene had won. Yet the victory felt strangely hollow. The Didact had expected the defeated humans to reveal plans for conquest or domination. Instead, interrogations painted an entirely different picture. Humanity insisted they had not invaded Forerunner territory to expand their empire. They claimed they had been fleeing something. Worse still, they claimed that the worlds they destroyed had already been infected by an enemy far more dangerous than the Forerunners understood: the Flood. To the Didact, the explanation bordered on absurd. He had encountered reports of the parasite before, but nothing suggested it posed an existential threat to a civilization as advanced as the Ecumene. Humanity's claims sounded less like truth and more like justification for the devastation they had caused. He remained skeptical. Like most Forerunners, he believed humanity was attempting to excuse a disastrous war they had already lost. History would later prove otherwise. The Flood had indeed driven humanity into impossible decisions. The colonies they sterilized had truly been infected. The populations they sacrificed had been sacrificed to slow a parasite that threatened all life in the galaxy. By the time the Didact realized this, it was far too late. Human civilization had already been dismantled. Its people had been stripped of their technological achievements. Most devastating of all, they had been forcibly devolved, reduced to a far more primitive state as punishment for crimes the Forerunners never fully understood. Unlike the librarian, the Didact never formed a deep admiration for humanity after the war. He respected them, he even pitied them, but he also remembered the devastation they had unleashed across the Ecumene. He remembered the countless Forerunners who had died fighting them. He remembered worlds that would never recover. Those memories remained with him. Even after learning the truth about the Flood, even after realizing humanity had been trying to contain an enemy the Ecumene had tragically underestimated. The Didact accepted that mistakes had been made. He never forgot who had made them. Those scars would remain buried for centuries. Then the flood returned, and everything humanity had tried to warn the galaxy about became horrifyingly real. The Human Forerunner War had ended in victory. The Ecumene remained intact. Its greatest military commander had defeated one of the only civilizations ever capable of challenging Forerunner supremacy. By every measure, the Didact should have emerged from the conflict more respected than ever before. Instead, his influence began to fade. Not because he had failed, but because the galaxy no longer believed it needed warriors. For millions of years, the Forerunners had stood as the undisputed masters of the Milky Way. With humanity defeated and no rival civilization capable of threatening the Ecumene, many believed the age of great wars had finally come to an end. Military strength, once viewed as the foundation of galactic stability, increasingly came to be seen as a relic of a more violent era. The balance of power began to shift. The warrior servants had long held tremendous influence over the direction of Forerunner society, but now another rate rose to prominence: the Builders. Led by the ambitious Master Builder, Faber, they argued that the future of the Ecumene would not be secured through fleets and soldiers, but through engineering, expansion, and the construction of ever greater wonders. The Halo installations, shield worlds, and countless megastructures that defined the Forerunner civilizations all owed their existence to the Builders' extraordinary vision. They were architects, scientists, engineers, and increasingly politicians. To many citizens, the Builders represented progress. The Didact was less convinced. He respected their brilliance, but he worried they had grown arrogant. The Forerunners had enjoyed peace for so long that many had begun to mistake good fortune for permanence. They believed the mantle guaranteed their place as guardians of the galaxy. They assumed that no enemy could ever truly threaten a civilization as advanced as their own. The Didact had spent his entire life studying war. He knew better. Peace was not permanent. It survived only because someone stood ready to defend it. His warnings became increasingly unpopular. Many members of the Ecumene saw him as a relic from another age, a commander still preparing for conflicts that no longer existed. Why continue devoting enormous resources to military forces when no civilization remained capable of challenging the Forerunners? The Didact's answer was simple: because someday one would. History had taught him that the greatest disasters often arrived precisely when civilizations convinced themselves they were invincible. Few listened. The disagreements between the Didact and the Builder leadership grew sharper with each passing century. While both believed they served the mantle of responsibility, they interpreted that sacred duty in profoundly different ways. To the Builders, the mantle justified shaping the galaxy through technological achievement. They believed civilization advanced by creating, expanding, and mastering the universe around them. To the Didact, the mantle demanded restraint. Power existed to protect life, not to demonstrate superiority. This philosophical divide slowly became political. The Didact found himself increasingly isolated within the highest levels of government. Decisions that had once fallen naturally to the warrior servants were redirected toward the Builders. Military budgets shrank. Defensive planning was postponed. Confidence replaced caution. The librarian watched these changes with growing concern. Although she did not always agree with her husband's methods, she understood the danger of allowing any single rate to dominate the Ecumene. The strength of the Forerunner Society had always come from balance. Builders created, life workers preserved, warrior servants defended. Remove one pillar, and the entire structure weakened. That balance was beginning to disappear. Eventually, the political struggle reached its breaking point. Rather than continue allowing the Didact to challenge Builder authority, the Ecumene removed him from command. For a man whose entire identity had been built around protecting the galaxy, it was an unimaginable humiliation. The greatest military commander in Forerunner history was stripped of the responsibility that had defined his life. His punishment was not execution, nor imprisonment in the conventional sense. Instead, he entered a cryptum, an advanced Forerunner chamber designed for extended meditation, healing, and philosophical reflection. Within its timeless confines, a Forerunner could remain dormant for years, centuries, or even longer, emerging physically unchanged while contemplating the experiences of countless lifetimes. Officially, it was presented as a period of reflection. In truth, it was exile. The Didact accepted the decision, but not because he believed it was just. He accepted it because he still believed in the institutions of the Ecumene. If the Council had judged that another path was best for the galaxy, he would not undermine the civilization he had spent millions of years defending. It was an act of remarkable discipline, yet it also carried a tragic irony. The one commander who had spent his life preparing for the unimaginable was removed from power just before the galaxy faced the greatest threat it would ever know. While the Didact sat in silence within his cryptum, the builders celebrated a future they believed would last forever. Beyond the borders of the Ecumene, however, something ancient was already stirring. The parasite humanity had tried so desperately to contain had not been defeated. It had merely been waiting. And when the flood returned, the Forerunners would discover that they had exiled the very commander they needed most. The Didact emerged from exile into a galaxy that was already beginning to collapse. Everything he had feared had come to pass. Not because another empire had risen to challenge the Ecumene, not because the builders had grown too ambitious, but because humanity had been telling the truth all along. The flood had returned. At first, the reports seemed almost insignificant. A missing colony, a remote research outpost that had suddenly gone silent, ships disappearing without explanation. To many within the Ecumene, these were isolated incidents. Forerunner civilization stretched across millions of worlds. Entire sectors could vanish beneath bureaucratic oversight before anyone realized something was wrong. The Didact had spent millions of years studying warfare. He knew the pattern. Real disasters never announced themselves with grand spectacles. They began quietly. By the time everyone noticed, it was already too late. As more reports arrived, disturbing similarities began to emerge. Colonies weren't simply being destroyed. Their populations had vanished. Military installations capable of resisting conventional invasion disappeared in a matter of days. Entire fleets stopped transmitting, only for their own vessels to later appear fighting alongside the parasite. The enemy was unlike anything the Forerunners had ever encountered. The flood did not conquer territory. It consumed it. Every victory made it stronger. Every casualty became another soldier. Every battlefield became another breeding ground. The Didact had fought civilizations before. He had fought fleets. He had fought brilliant commanders. But he had never faced an enemy that grew more powerful every time he inflicted losses upon it. Traditional warfare simply did not apply. His instincts as a commander remained as sharp as ever. He reorganized defensive lines, coordinated massive fleet movements, and attempted to isolate infected systems before the parasite could spread farther. Entire sectors were placed under military quarantine. Slip space routes were monitored relentlessly. Worlds deemed beyond saving were destroyed to deny Flood new hosts. These were terrible decisions, but they were rational ones. For perhaps the first time in his career, the Didact found himself ordering the destruction of the very populations he had dedicated his life to protecting. Each order weighed upon him. Each decision haunted him. Yet every hesitation cost even more lives. The Flood offered no mercy. Neither could he. At first, there were victories. Forerunner fleets reclaimed systems. Infected worlds were sterilized. Outbreaks were contained. Many within the Ecumene believed the crisis would soon pass. The Didact never shared their optimism. He had begun studying every engagement personally. Something troubled him. The Flood wasn't behaving like an ordinary parasite. It adapted. Every battle seemed to teach it something new. Military strategies that succeeded once became ineffective weeks later. Defensive formations were anticipated before they could be executed. Entire fleets found themselves ambushed by tactics that should have been impossible for a mindless infection to coordinate. The Didact reached a horrifying conclusion. The Flood was learning. Worse still, it was remembering. Every infected commander added centuries of military expertise to the parasite's growing intelligence. Every absorbed scientist contributed knowledge. Every civilization consumed expanded its understanding of the galaxy. The Didact slowly realized he was no longer fighting an epidemic. He was fighting an intelligence that grew wiser with every battle. As the war escalated, even the Forerunner's technological superiority began to erode. Fleets that had once been invincible started suffering catastrophic losses. Entire fortifications fell with alarming speed. Worlds that had stood secure for millions of years disappeared almost overnight. For the first time in Forerunner history, the Ecumene was losing. The psychological toll on the Didact was immense. For millions of years he had believed that careful planning, discipline, and courage could overcome any enemy. The Flood challenged every one of those beliefs. There was no decisive battle to win. No capital world whose capture would end the conflict. No leader whose death would shatter enemy morale. The Flood had no fear. No exhaustion. No desire for a negotiation. It sought only one thing: more life to consume. The Didact began sleeping less. He immersed himself completely in the war, reviewing battle reports, casualty lists, and strategic projections without end. Those closest to him noticed subtle changes. The commander who had once balanced confidence with compassion became increasingly distant. Every decision became colder, every calculation more clinical, not because he cared less, because he cared too much. Every casualty report represented another failure. Every world he had not saved, another civilization that had trusted him. The librarian watched these changes with quiet concern. She understood better than anyone that her husband carried the weight of the galaxy upon his shoulders. She reminded him that no single individual could bear the responsibility of every life lost in a war of this scale. The Didact wanted to believe her, but every time another system fell, every time another fleet vanished, every time another desperate call for help arrived too late, he reached the same conclusion. If he had acted differently, perhaps they would still be alive. It was a burden no one could carry forever. Yet the worst revelation still lay ahead, because somewhere beyond the battlefield waited a being older than the Forerunners themselves, a creature that knew exactly what the Flood truly was, and it had been waiting for the Didact all along. By the final years of the Flood War, The Didact had come to a conclusion he once would have considered impossible. The Forerunners did not understand their enemy. They possessed the greatest fleets ever assembled, weapons capable of extinguishing stars, technology that bordered on the miraculous. Yet despite all of it, they were losing. It was not simply because the flood was powerful. It was because the flood always seemed one step ahead. Their parasite anticipated strategies that should have been impossible to predict. It manipulated entire civilizations, spread with terrifying efficiency, and demonstrated an intelligence that no disease should possess. The more the Didact studied the war, the more convinced he became that the flood was not merely an organism. Someone, or something, was directing it. The answer had been imprisoned for thousands of years. Long before humanity had fought the Forerunners, ancient humans had captured a being unlike any other in the galaxy. They imprisoned it upon the world of Sharam Hakur, believing it too dangerous to remain free. When the Forerunners defeated humanity, they inherited that prison without fully understanding what lay inside. The prisoner was only known as the Primordial. To most Forerunners, it was little more than an ancient curiosity. Some believed it to be a surviving precursor. Others dismissed it as an incomprehensible relic from an age that had ended millions of years before the Ecumene existed. The Didact could no longer afford to ignore it. If anyone understood the flood, it would be the being that had existed before Forerunner civilization itself. The Primordial was brought under heavy guard, and the Didact attempted something few others would have dared. He tried to reason with it. The conversations that followed are among the strangest and most disturbing events in Halo's history. The Primordial did not threaten him. It did not plead for freedom. It did not bargain. Instead, it spoke with complete certainty. It answered questions with riddles. It challenged assumptions the Didact had never thought to question. Most unsettling of all, it acted as though the outcome of the war had already been decided. The Didact demanded answers. What was the flood? Why had it returned? How could it be stopped? The Primordial's responses offered little comfort. It claimed the flood was no accident, no natural disaster, no random parasite. It was the final expression of the precursors themselves, the beings who had once created both humanity and the Forerunners. The Didact struggled to accept such a claim. Everything the Forerunners believed about their own history rested upon the assumption that they had inherited the mantle of responsibility from the precursors. The mantle was the sacred obligation to protect all life in the galaxy. It justified the Ecumene's authority. It gave purpose to millions of years of expansion. The Primordial shattered that belief. It revealed that the precursors had never intended the Forerunners to inherit the mantle at all. They had chosen humanity. The Forerunners had rebelled. In fear of losing their place, they had turned upon their own creators, driving the precursors to extinction, or so they believed. Some escaped. Others attempted to preserve themselves by reducing their bodies to a fine biological dust, hoping to be reborn in the distant future. Instead, that dust decayed, mutated, became corrupted over millions of years. It eventually transformed into something entirely different: the flood. Whether every detail of the Primordial's account was true remains one of Halo's great mysteries. The being delighted in manipulating those who questioned it, and it often mixed profound truths with cryptic half-answers. But the Didact had no reason to believe the creature was simply inventing stories. Too much suddenly made sense. Humanity's desperate war, the flood's impossible intelligence, its hatred of the Forerunners, its ability to coordinate across unimaginable distances. This was not merely an infection, it was revenge. Then came the revelation that haunted the Didact more than any other. The primordial claimed that the flood was not trying to destroy life, it was trying to unite it. Every mind consumed became part of something greater. Every civilization absorbed became another voice within a single, eternal consciousness. The flood did not see itself as committing genocide. It believed it was ending suffering, ending individuality, ending conflict, creating what the primordial called unity. To the Didact, it was a nightmare beyond comprehension. Everything he had dedicated his life to protecting, freedom, identity, civilization, choice, would all vanish forever beneath a single consciousness. Death would have been preferable. The primordial understood exactly how to attack him, not with weapons, but with ideas. It questioned the mantle itself. Had the Forerunners truly earned it? Had they ever protected life, or had they merely ruled over it? Were they guardians or usurpers? For perhaps the first time in millions of years, the Didact doubted, not because he accepted the primordial's philosophy, but because he realized that the Forerunners had built their civilization upon assumptions they had never truly questioned. Those conversations changed him forever. When the interrogations finally ended, the primordial was executed by having its time lock accelerated until its body crumbled into dust. But its greatest weapon had never been its body. It was its words. The primordial died. Its ideas did not. The Didact left those encounters carrying a burden even greater than before. He was no longer fighting merely to save the Ecumene. He was fighting an enemy that believed history itself had judged the Forerunners unworthy. And for the first time since the war had begun, he began to wonder whether conventional victory was even possible. If the galaxy was to survive, he would need to become something it had never asked him to be. Not merely its greatest defender, its last hope. By the time the Didact left the primordial's prison, he was no longer the same man. The galaxy had not simply changed around him. His understanding of it had been shattered. For millions of years, he had believed that every problem could eventually be solved through courage, discipline, and intelligent leadership. Even the human Forerunner War had ultimately been won through superior strategy and determination. The flood had destroyed that certainty. Every conventional weapon had failed. Every military doctrine had become obsolete. Every victory lasted only until the parasite returned stronger than before. The Didact was no longer asking how to win the war. He was asking whether victory was still possible. Unfortunately, he was not the only one searching for desperate solutions. Deep within Forerunner research facilities, another controversial project had been progressing for centuries. It was called the Composer. Originally conceived by the builders, the Composer was one of the most advanced and dangerous pieces of technology the Forerunners had ever created. Its intended purpose had been noble. It could scan and preserve a living mind, translating an individual's consciousness into digital form while capturing an astonishing amount of their personality, memories, and thought processes. In theory, it represented a way to preserve life beyond biological death. In practice, it was catastrophic. The process was horribly unstable. The resulting digital minds were incomplete, damaged, broken. Most subjects did not survive the transition in any meaningful sense. The project was considered a failure. Many believed it should never be used again. Under normal circumstances, the Didact would have agreed. Years earlier, he likely would have condemned the Composer as another example of the builders placing technological ambition ahead of ethical responsibility. But these were no longer normal circumstances. Every day the flood consumed billions. Entire species disappeared forever. Worlds that had flourished for millions of years became silent tombs in a matter of weeks. The Didact found himself confronting an impossible question. If biological life inevitably became flood biomass, was remaining biological life truly worth preserving? The answer horrified him. Perhaps not. If the flood required living hosts, then perhaps the only way to deny it victory was to create soldiers it could never infect. Machines, digital minds, warriors beyond the parasite's reach. It was a terrible idea. It was also the first idea that seemed capable of changing the course of the war. Many within the Ecumene rejected the proposal immediately, the librarian among them. To her, preserving life meant preserving the individual. A person's body, mind, experiences, and identity formed a single whole. Destroying the body while leaving behind only an imperfect digital echo was not salvation. It was annihilation disguised as preservation. The Didact understood her argument. He even agreed with it, if there had been another choice. But every alternative was disappearing. He had watched countless soldiers become flood combat forms. He had witnessed entire fleets consumed from within. He had seen heroes transformed into monsters before their comrades' eyes. Every warrior lost strengthened the enemy. Every victory carried the seeds of the next defeat. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the Didact's priorities began to shift. For most of his life, he had fought to protect individual lives. Now he fought himself fighting to preserve civilization itself. Those were not always the same objective. If sacrificing thousands could save trillions, could he refuse? If sacrificing one species could preserve every other, was that truly evil? These questions consumed him. The Didact did not arrive at his answers lightly. He wrestled with them constantly. He argued with the librarian. He questioned his own conscience. He searched desperately for another path. Again and again, there wasn't one. Eventually, he authorized the creation of a new military force unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen, the Prometheans. Before the Flood War, the Prometheans had been an elite order of warrior servants, volunteers who represented the very best the Ecumene had to offer. Courageous, disciplined, and fiercely loyal, they fought where the danger was greatest and inspired those around them through their unwavering resolve. Now, under the Didact's new vision, the name would take on an entirely different meaning. Using the composer, living beings could be converted into mechanical soldiers whose digitized essences inhabited powerful armored bodies. They no longer required food or rest. They could survive environments that would instantly kill biological warriors. Most importantly, the flood could not infect them. To the Didact, they represented hope. To the librarian, they represented everything the Forerunners were fighting against. Their arguments grew more frequent, more bitter. She believed the composer stripped away the very thing that made life worth protecting. He believed refusing to use it guaranteed the extinction of all life. Neither questioned the other's motives. Neither doubted the other's love. But for the first time in millions of years, they could no longer agree on what it meant to save the galaxy. History often portrays this moment as the Didact's descent into madness. The truth is more tragic. He did not embrace the composer because he had stopped valuing life. He embraced it because he valued life so much that he became willing to sacrifice pieces of it to preserve the whole. That distinction mattered. It did not excuse what came next, but it explains it. Unfortunately, desperation has a way of moving the line between necessity and atrocity. Once the Didact convinced himself that the composer could save the galaxy, the question was no longer whether it should be used, only who should be composed. And the answer to that question would forever define how history remembered him. If there was one person in the galaxy who still believed the Didact could be saved. It was the librarian. She had stood beside him for millions of years. She had watched him rise from an extraordinary warrior servant to the greatest military commander the Ecumene had ever known. She had seen the compassion beneath his discipline, the humility behind his authority, and the quiet burden he carried every time another life was lost under his command. She knew the man he had been. That was precisely why what she had now witnessed frightened her so deeply. The Didact had not become cruel. He had become convinced. That distinction made all the difference. Cruelty could sometimes be reasoned with. Conviction could not. The composer program expanded rapidly under his authority. More Prometheans entered service, each one representing another life transformed into something neither fully living nor truly dead. To the Didact, every new Promethean was another warrior the Flood could never claim. To the librarian, every one was another person who had been irrevocably lost. Their disagreements, once respectful debates between equals, became painful arguments that neither wished to have. The Didact insisted that extraordinary circumstances demanded extraordinary measures. The librarian answered that abandoning their principles meant surrendering to the Flood even before the war had been lost. Neither doubted the other's sincerity. Each believed the other was making a terrible mistake. The divide between them widened further after the Didact proposed an idea that horrified nearly everyone who heard it. If humanity had been chosen by the precursors, if humanity's eventual return threatened the stability of the mantle, then perhaps humanity itself represented an unacceptable risk. Rather than preserve the species for the future, as the librarian intended, the Didact argued they should instead become the foundation of his new Promethean army. From a military perspective, his reasoning followed the same grim logic that had guided him for years. Humanity possessed resilience, adaptability, and tremendous potential. As Prometheans, they could become an army capable of fighting the Flood forever without fear of infection. From every moral perspective, it was indefensible. The librarian pleaded with him to reconsider. She reminded him of everything they had built together. She reminded him why they had accepted the mantle in the first place. It was never about preserving power. It was about preserving life. The Didact answered with a question that neither of them could truly escape. What life will remain if we lose? There was no easy answer. Every day the Flood consumed more worlds. Every day billions vanished forever. Every day the options grew fewer. The librarian understood why he had reached this point. She simply refused to follow him there. Eventually she reached a heartbreaking conclusion. The greatest threat to the future of the galaxy was no longer only the Flood. It was also the man she loved. Not because he desired domination, not because he had become evil, but because desperation had convinced him that any sacrifice was acceptable if it meant victory. The Didact could no longer distinguish between saving life and merely ensuring something survived. The librarian made perhaps the most painful decision of her entire existence. She would stop him. Not with violence, not through execution. She could not bring herself to destroy the man who had spent millions of years protecting the galaxy. Instead, she chose mercy. Using a cryptum, she imprisoned the Didact once again. This time, there would be no promise of release, no certainty that they would ever see one another again. Their final meeting was not one of hatred. It was one of profound sorrow. Neither believed they were betraying the other. Each believed they were making the only choice that could still save the galaxy. As the cryptum sealed, the librarian watched the man she loved disappear into silence. She hoped that time might heal him, that one day he would awaken free from the despair that had consumed him. She could not know that the opposite would happen. The Didact would not spend years inside the cryptum, nor centuries. He would spend 100,000 years alone with his grief. And when he finally emerged, the galaxy would meet not the hero she had married, but the broken man she had tried so desperately to save. There are prisons built from walls, and then there are prisons built from time. The Didact experienced both. When the cryptum closed around him, the war was still raging. The flood continued its relentless advance across the galaxy. The halo array had not yet been fired. The librarian was still alive. Somewhere beyond the chamber that now imprisoned him, civilization fought for its very survival. Then, silence. The cryptum was one of the most extraordinary creations of the Forerunners. It was designed to sustain its occupant indefinitely, preserving both body and mind while placing them into a state of deep meditation. Time outside became almost meaningless. The occupant could reflect, dream, relive memories, and contemplate ideas for spans of time impossible for most species to comprehend. For many Forerunners, the cryptum was a place of healing. For the Didact, it became something else entirely. At first, he believed the librarian would return. Surely she would realize the mistake. Surely the council would see reason. Surely someone would awaken him once the war demanded his leadership again. No one came. Days became years. Years became centuries. Centuries became millennia. Outside the cryptum, the Flood War reached its terrible conclusion. The halo array fired, extinguishing nearly all sentient life in the galaxy to starve the flood of hosts. The surviving Forerunners fulfilled the librarian's conservation measure, reseeding life throughout the Milky Way before departing forever. The Ecumene, the civilization the Didact had devoted millions of years to protecting, ceased to exist. He never saw its final days. He never fought its last battles. He never said goodbye to the people he had sworn to defend. Instead, he remained alone. 100,000 years. It is a length of time so immense that the human mind struggles to grasp it. 100,000 years before the Didact awakened, modern humans had not yet built cities. Agriculture did not exist. Writing had not been invented. Entire human civilizations would rise, flourish, collapse, and vanish into history dozens of times before his imprisonment finally ended. And through it all, he waited. The isolation did something the flood could never. It transformed grief into certainty. With no one to challenge his thoughts, the Didact replayed every decision of the war again and again. Every argument with the librarian, every order he had given, every warning that had gone ignored, every world that had fallen. Over countless ages, memory became interpretation. Interpretation became conviction. Conviction became obsession. He convinced himself that he had been right all along. Had the Ecumene embraced the composer sooner, perhaps the flood could have been defeated. Had the council trusted him instead of the builders, perhaps billions could have been saved. Had the librarian stood beside him instead of opposing him, perhaps the Forerunners would still rule the galaxy. The Didact no longer questioned these beliefs. There was no one left to question them. Loneliness has a peculiar effect on the mind. Without new experiences, old memories become sharper, but not necessarily more accurate. The mind fills gaps, reinforces old conclusions, and slowly reshapes the past into a story that feels internally consistent. That is exactly what happened. The Didact remembered the librarian's compassion, but increasingly he remembered it as weakness. He remembered humanity's courage, but increasingly he remembered only the destruction that they had brought during the ancient war. He remembered the mantle, but its meaning subtly changed. Once, the mantle had represented stewardship. Now, it represented authority. Someone had to rule the galaxy. Someone had to make impossible decisions. Someone had to protect civilization, even if civilization hated them for it. Who better than the last Didact? What he could not know was that the librarian had never abandoned him. Before the halo array was fired, she had spent her final years preparing humanity to inherit a future they could scarcely imagine. Through the Gias she had implanted within human genetics, through hidden facilities scattered across the galaxy, and through the careful reseeding of life itself, she laid the foundation for a civilization that might one day succeed where the Forerunners had failed. She believed humanity deserved another chance. The Didact saw only betrayal. To him, the librarian had chosen the species that the precursors had once favored over her own husband. Over 100,000 years, that wound never healed. It deepened. By the end of his imprisonment, the compassionate warrior servant, who had once measured victory by the lives he saved, had become something else entirely. He still believed he was acting for the good of the galaxy. He still believed he was fulfilling the mantle. He still believed he was its rightful guardian. But now there was one final obstacle standing between him and the future he envisioned: humanity. When the cryptum finally opened, after 100 millennia, the galaxy expected to awaken an ancient forerunner. Instead, it awakened a man whose war had never truly ended. For everyone else, 100,000 years had passed. For the Didact, the battle had simply resumed. When the Didact's cryptum finally opened, the galaxy was unrecognizable. The mighty Akumene was gone. The builder rate no longer existed. The warrior servants had vanished into history. The life workers were little more than forgotten legends. Even the Flood, the enemy that had consumed every waking moment of his final years, had seemingly disappeared. The Forerunner civilization had become myth. The Didact emerged into a universe that had moved on without him. Yet in many ways, he had not moved on at all. To everyone else, 100,000 years had passed. To him, the wounds were still fresh. The betrayals still burned. The war still demanded a victor. His prison lay within the shield world known as Requiem, an immense artificial planet constructed during the final days of the Forerunner Empire. Hidden from the rest of the galaxy, it had remained dormant for 100 millennia, faithfully carrying out its purpose: protect the Didact and wait until one day when someone would come. And that someone was not a Forerunner. It was a human. In 2557, following the destruction of Installation 4 and the end of the Human Covenant War, the UNSC Forward onto Dawn drifted through space. Aboard the damaged vessel were two survivors, Master Chief Petty Officer John 117 and the AI Cortana. Drawn toward Requiem by a powerful gravitational force, the ship crashed onto the ancient shield world, unknowingly setting into motion events that had been waiting 100,000 years to unfold. To the Master Chief, Requiem was another mysterious Forerunner installation. To the Didact, it was the tomb of his civilization. When he first encountered humanity again, the emotions that had simmered within him for 100,000 years surged to the surface. These were not merely descendants of ancient humans. In his mind, they were the heirs to everything the Forerunners had lost. The librarian had believed humanity should inherit the mantle. The Didact believed they had inherited it by mistake. To him, humanity remained impulsive, violent, and unworthy of the responsibility the precursors had once intended for them. Worse still, they had been elevated while the Forerunners, the civilization that had sacrificed itself to save all life, had faded into extinction. History had rewarded the wrong species. When Master Chief inadvertently released the Didact from his cryptum, he believed he was simply awakening another ancient Forerunner. He could not have known he was freeing perhaps the most dangerous individual left alive in the galaxy. The Didact immediately resumed the mission he believed had been stolen from him: preserve the mantle, restore order, remove humanity. Unlike the warrior servant of old, however, his methods had changed. He no longer sought to defeat humanity through conventional warfare. He intended to use the composer. The very device that had once divided him from the librarian would now become his ultimate weapon. The composer had survived the fall of the Ecumene, hidden away within the installation known as Ivanov Station. As the UNSC raced to understand the Didact's intentions, he struck with overwhelming speed. Boarding the station, he reclaimed the ancient machine with almost effortless precision, killing countless personnel in the process. The Master Chief arrived too late. The composer was once again in the Didact's hands. His destination was Earth, not to conquer it, not to occupy it, but to transform it. Hovering above New Phoenix, the Didact activated the composer against one of humanity's largest population centers. In an instant, millions of people were stripped of their physical forms. Their bodies disintegrated as their neural patterns were extracted, leaving behind only digital echoes that the Didact intended to shape into a new generation of Promethean soldiers. It was one of the single greatest atrocities in modern human history. To everyone watching, it was unimaginable horror. To the Didact, it was salvation. He believed he was saving those minds from the weakness of flesh. He believed they would become immortal warriors incapable of infection, forever protecting the galaxy against any future return of the Flood. Even now, he did not see himself as a murderer. He saw himself as the only person willing to make the sacrifices necessary to ensure life endured. That belief made him more dangerous than any tyrant driven by hatred, because hatred can fade. Conviction rarely does. The Master Chief pursued the Didact aboard its colossal command ship, Mantle's Approach. There, humanity's greatest soldier confronted the last great warrior servant of the Forerunner Ecumene. The battle itself was surprisingly brief. This was never a contest between equals. The Didact possessed technology, armor, and abilities beyond anything humanity could hope to match. Even Master Chief survived only through determination, extraordinary luck, and the unwavering support of Cortana. In the end, it was not strength that defeated the Didact, it was sacrifice. Having fragmented herself repeatedly to slow the Didact's advance through the ship's systems, Cortana managed to create just enough of an opening for Master Chief to attach a Havoc nuclear device to the composer. As the weapon detonated, the composer was destroyed, and the Didact was cast into the slipspace rupture below. For the galaxy, it appeared to be the end. The last great Forerunner warlord had fallen. Humanity had prevailed. Master Chief had saved Earth. But appearances can be deceiving. The Didact survived, and his story was not yet over. History has a habit of reducing extraordinary lives to a single moment. For the Didact, that moment was New Phoenix. To billions across the galaxy, he would forever be remembered as the ancient Forerunner who emerged from a forgotten world, murdered millions of innocent people, and was defeated by the Master Chief. It is an accurate description, but it is not the whole story. The Didact did not die aboard Mantle's Approach. Though the destruction of the composer and the Havoc detonation hurled him into slipspace rupture, his armor preserved his life. Gravely wounded, but still alive, he drifted through the impossible currents of slipspace until he eventually emerged once more into a galaxy that still had no place for him. His return would not be as dramatic as his first awakening. There would be no fleets, no armies, no declarations of war. Instead, his final chapter unfolded in relative obscurity, chronicled primarily in the Halo Escalation comics. Blue Team, Master Chief, Fred 104, Kelly 087, and Linda 058. eventually confronted the Didact one last time at Installation 3. By then, he remained every bit as brilliant and determined as he had always been, but the overwhelming power that had once made him nearly unstoppable had begun to erode. The Didact still believed he alone understood what the galaxy required. He still believed humanity's rise represented a mistake that needed correcting. He still viewed himself as the rightful guardian of the mantle. Nothing had changed, except the galaxy itself. The age of the Forerunners had ended 100,000 years earlier. Whether the Didact accepted it or not, history had moved beyond him. During the final confrontation, another figure from the ancient past returned to confront him, the Didact. Born stellar makes eternal lasting. The younger Forerunner, who had inherited the title of Didact during the final days of the Flood War. The man who had fired the Halo array. The one who had carried the burden the Didact never could. With the assistance of the library's long-prepared plans and the combined efforts of humanity, the Didact was finally defeated, not through brute force, but through one of the oldest technologies in the Forerunner arsenal, a composer. The very device he had once embraced as salvation. Its energy was turned against him. His physical form was unraveled, his essence dispersed. Unlike those he had transformed into Prometheans, however, the Didact's consciousness was not preserved within mechanical soldiers. Instead, his existence dissolved into the vast digital domain known as the domain itself. Whether this should be considered death, transcendence, imprisonment, or something else entirely remains uncertain. Halo intentionally leaves the question unanswered. In a way, it is a strangely fitting end. The man who had spent millions of years trying to preserve civilization through absolute control ultimately became part of something far larger than himself. Not as a ruler, not as a conqueror, simply another voice among countless others. So how should history remember the Didact? Was he Halo's greatest villain? Certainly. His actions in New Phoenix alone ensured that. Was he a monster? By the end of his life, many would argue yes. He embraced atrocities that cannot be defended. He became willing to sacrifice entire populations for what he believed was the greater good. He lost sight of the very individuals he had once dedicated himself to protecting. But reducing him to a monster alone ignores the tragedy that defines his story. This was not a man who sought power for wealth. He did not crave worship. He did not conquer for personal glory. Everything he did, every terrible decision, every impossible compromise, every unforgivable act, grew from a single belief that someone had to save the galaxy. And if no one else possessed the strength to make the necessary sacrifices, then that burden belonged to him. That belief destroyed him. The flood never infected the Didact. Hatred was not what consumed him. Despair did. He witnessed civilization's fall. He watched the greatest empire in history collapse. He lost his home, his people, and his purpose. And perhaps most painfully of all, he lost the woman who had spent millions of years reminding him why life mattered beyond simply surviving. Without the librarian, the Didact slowly forgot what he had originally been fighting for. He continued protecting civilization, but somewhere along the way, he stopped protecting the people within it. Perhaps that is why the Didact remains one of Halo's most fascinating characters. He is not the story of a hero who secretly became evil. He is the story of a good man who slowly convinced himself that the ends could justify any means. Every step made sense to him. Every compromise seemed necessary. Every sacrifice appeared unavoidable, until one day, there was almost nothing left of the man he had once been. The Didact began his life believing that the strongest warrior was the one who protected others. He ended it believing that the strongest warrior was the one willing to sacrifice others. That single change transformed the greatest defender in the history of the Forerunners into one of the most feared figures the galaxy would ever know. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson this story offers. Evil rarely begins with cruelty. Sometimes it begins with the sincere belief that only you can save the world. The Didact spent millions of years trying to preserve the galaxy. In the end, the galaxy survived, but not because of him, because others remembered what he had forgotten. That life is worth protecting, not simply because it endures, but because every individual life has value. The Didact never stopped believing he was the galaxy's guardian. History simply reached the painful conclusion that its greatest guardian had become the very thing it needed saving from.